Construction Stormwater General Permit webinar. Thank you so much for attending the webinar today. My name is Ann Gelbman, and I work here at the MPCA in the St. Paul office in the Stormwater program. With me in the room today are 3 other stormwater professional staff and Todd Smith, our stormwater engineer, that will be walking you through the proposed changes to the Construction Stormwater General Permit. The draft CSW permit is on public notice, and you can submit official comments until May 23rd. Check the state register for more details on that. This webinar is to explain the changes from the current permit to the draft permit. If you have questions or comments during Todd's presentation, please use the Q&A box. You may be seeing a chat box and a Q&A box, and we're asking you to use the Q&A box, please. We will be monitoring the questions that come in, and we will do our best to answer your questions. If your question or comment is not addressed during the webinar, we will post the answers to all the questions in the Stormwater Manual on the Construction Stormwater Permit page. Please note that the changes guide in the Stormwater Manual, and you can follow along with that document during the webinar. This webinar is being recorded and will be available for viewing later this week. It will be posted in the Stormwater Manual, again on the Construction Stormwater page. And Todd's presentation today will also be in the Stormwater Manual on that same page. Some people aren't hearing us. So if you're not able to hear, make sure that you have hooked up your headphones to your computer. We are not using a telephone. Oh, they can't hear me. Sorry for those who can hear us. We're getting some feedback from some people that they're not able to hear us. So we are sending them a message in the box. So sorry, we'll begin as soon as we can get everyone to be able to hear.
Yes.
Okay, so some people are able to hear us and some are not. Bear with us while we get everyone able to hear us. And then Todd will start his presentation.
For those of you that can hear us, the presentation today is going to mostly be following the Guide to Permit Changes document, which is available on the website that is on your screen. It's an Excel document. It's got all the changes that we made to the permit. That is the outline for today's presentation. You, of course, are welcome to ask questions about any part of the permit, and we had a bunch of questions. We might do some of those other questions at the end. I'll try and hit the questions that were asked in regards to the changes as we go through it here. And it's not clear to me if we've got most people hearing us.
I think most people are. It looks like there's about 7 or 8 that can't.
Okay.
Right now we have 160 attendees on this webinar.
That's great. 160 people.
And some of you may be in a room with multiple people, which is great. We appreciate that.
And many questions were provided ahead of time, which I thank you for that. I've tried to sprinkle those in as the topics go here. And like I said, if there were questions or comments on parts of the permit that are not changing, which is fine, we'll cover some of those at the end. Ann mentioned the public comment period is going to May 23rd. That is a change. We have extended the public comment period by 2 weeks, 14 days, until May 23rd. That has not been announced yet. We're hoping to get that published in the state register soon, and we'll reflect it on the website. We're kind of announcing that for the first time right here. So there is an extension on the public comment period to May 23rd. So make a note of that. One thing I wanted to clarify today about the presentation is that we really want to focus on the changes, and I really want to make sure that you understand what our intent is. The format today is not very conducive to debating the merits of these requirements. That is not the point of the meeting today. I just want you to understand what our intentions were with some of these changes. So we are billing this permit as no major changes this time around. It's quite a bit different than it was in the past. In the year 2003, we launched Phase 2, which was a huge deal. I should say the EPA launched Phase 2, where we started to permit construction sites down to 1 acre in size. It started at 5 acres. So that was a major change that occurred in 2003. We also added a whole different section of different requirements for projects that were discharging special waters and impaired waters. In 2008, we introduced a mandatory infiltration requirement for certain sites, and we expanded the area to which the additional requirements for special and impaired waters apply. Last time around in 2013 was another major change. We now required 1 inch of volume reduction for those sites that were creating new impervious surface and requiring stormwater management, which was a big change. We also had the EPA C&D rule to deal with in 2013. The EPA finalized their effluent limitation guidelines and new source performance standards for the construction and development industry, which we call that whole thing the C&D rule, on February 1st of 2010. Basically, all state permits need to reflect the EPA's C&D rule. So we had a lot of changes in 2013 that were specifically focused on that. Those were all big changes. Those were wide sweeping changes that affected nearly every construction project that's out there. In 2018, we do have a number of changes, but I don't think that any of them are major. There's nothing that's wide sweeping that's going to affect everybody or all types of projects. There are certainly changes that will affect your project on a project-to-project basis. But no major changes in 2018. So I mentioned this document, the guide to changes for the draft permit, which is available on the website. You might want to have this out. This is the outline, as I mentioned, for the day today. I'm going to go through this whole thing. It's all the changes. I wanted to talk a little bit about this document. This document is intended to encompass all of the changes that we made. All of the changes that result in a change of policy or a change in meaning or just a changing in the expectation of what the MPCA is looking for. They should all be listed in here. There are other things on this document that are not a change in policy, meaning, or expectation, but they are a point of interest or otherwise a part of the permit that looks so different that I thought I should include it on here. So we have this document, and I did mark each one of these with an asterisk as to whether I thought that it was a change in policy, meaning, or expectation, or whether or not it was not a change in policy, meaning, or expectation. So, not every change is listed in here that was a format change, for example. I have some examples of that here coming up. But if we did make a change in the words and we are expecting something different from you, it's on this list. I have an example here that we can go through. And I kind of just picked one here. Let's take a look at what the permit says for perimeter control. We'll look at what the permit says now and what it says in the draft permit and compare the two here. And I think this is a really good example of what we did throughout this entire document. We went through this whole thing and changed and rearranged everything, as I'm sure you noticed as you went through it. So perimeter control, which is one of our basic permit requirements, some people call it the silt fence requirement. And we do require perimeter controls in certain areas, and it does not have to be a silt fence. It can be whatever you think is the most appropriate best management practice for that situation. But the permit will tell you where these things need to be. So in the current permit for Part 4C1, we talk about installing sediment control practices as necessary to minimize sediment from entering surface waters. So if you have a wetland in the middle of your project, you have to have a perimeter control around that. That's what that's saying. In Part C2, 4C2 of the current permit, we talk about establishing perimeter controls on all down gradient perimeters. That's the other area of your site where you are required to have some type of perimeter control. So we want to see something around the outside of the site, on the down gradient side, and around any surface waters that are on or adjacent to the project. In the current permit, in Part 4C2, it also goes on to say a clarifying statement about a floating silt curtain, and the fact that we do not recognize a floating silt curtain as being a perimeter control for the purposes of this requirement. And this is the way that it's laid out in the current permit. So we took a look at this, and we have tried to combine things that were like topics. We tried to separate things that were separate topics, and several different people have read through this permit and adjusted the permit language with an eye towards being efficient with words, adding clarity, using plain language. So you can see the results here on the right. This is our draft permit. It is shorter. We have less words. We took the two places where we talk about where perimeter controls are supposed to be, and we put it into one statement, which is now item 9.2. And we'll say all down gradient perimeters of the area need to have, all down gradient areas need to have perimeter control, and areas of the site that drain to any surface waters need to have perimeter control. So we took those two ideas and we put it in the same box, item 9.2. And this clarifying statement of floating silt curtain got moved to a different piece, which is now 9.5. So a lot of rearranging there, a lot of new words there. There's no change here. We have no proposed change for when we're expecting these perimeter controls to be established. And you won't find this on the list of changes, the guide to changes. It's not in there. We have no change in policy. There's no change in meeting here. But it definitely looks different. So I'm just using this as an example to show you what we did throughout this entire document. So the permit has a whole new format, as I'm sure you've noticed as well. The MPCA is in the process of standardizing the format for all of our permits issued. It's all part of our new computer system here that we use for a number of things, including generation of permits. And all the permits that come out of this building are going to look more or less the same. So we have all had to adjust to that. As I mentioned, the document was also edited for grammar, was edited for consistency with other permits. We changed the wording on a lot of these requirements from a passive tense to an active tense. Nearly every part of this permit has been rewritten in some way. It is shorter. We have about 20% fewer words total, if you do a word count on that. So we were able to get a little bit more efficient with that. Something to keep in mind, I know a lot of people have stormwater pollution prevention plan templates. I'm sure there's a lot of documents that have been generated for your city or for your business or for your company where some of this formatting change may affect that. So I hope you take a minute to think about the ramifications of the new format. One of them that I'll talk about right now is what we did for the table of contents. So let's take a look at the table of contents. We have our current permit on the left-hand side. Our new draft permit is on the right-hand side. They look very different, but they do have a lot of similarities. The 25 items that we have in the new table of contents for the draft permit basically follows these part numbers in the current permit. So we have the big letters A, B, C, and D all the way down. We have Appendix A and we have Appendix B. That is basically the makeup of the new table of contents. What we've gotten rid of are these major headings, the Roman numerals, all the way down, parts 1 through 5. Those have been omitted, and there are some ramifications for omitting those. Specifically, our state rules refer to those, and I'll discuss it a little bit more as we go through here. It is listed as one of the changes. So just hold on to that thought for a minute. Those large Roman numeral part numbers that we have talked about for years are now, they're no longer there. The other thing we changed in the table of contents is we reduced down the general provisions section into just one part, as you can see there. And the permanent stormwater management system piece, which encompassed numerous parts to it, it was all of our specific design parameters for wet sedimentation basins, infiltration basins, filtration basins. We expanded those and gave each of those their own section. So it got a little bit shorter in one way and a little bit longer in another way, and that is the makeup of the new table of contents. The notice of coverage process is changing a little bit as well. Currently, when you apply for the permit and you complete your payment successfully, you are emailed a coverage letter and a coverage card the following day. And that's going to change a little bit. The new system actually generates a permit for each project, each specific project, and that becomes available, and we will send that out to you. So the permit itself will look the same from project to project. This is a general permit. But the way the system works is it will produce a cover page for that permit with your name on it and your project's name on it, and it will be your permit for your project, and that is what we're going to be sending out. That is how the system is set up. The actual application procedure is going to remain the same. We have our online application. And we do have also an electronic version of the permit, which will, of course, look the same as the permit we're talking about today, but it's going to be in a wiki format, and it's going to be well connected, if you will. The permit will link to itself if it refers to a part number, and it will link to outside documents if those are relevant. We have this started. I posted it on that website, the same website we were talking about, where we are posting the fact sheet, draft permit, and the guide to changes document. You can also find the electronic version of the permit there, and we have just converted that into a wiki format. I think that web page right now is the only place that I've linked to it. I don't really consider it finished yet. We're going to do some more formatting to it and some more interlinkage, if you will, on that document. It should be pretty slick when it's done. It's already pretty good if you want to take a look at it and use that as a way to look at the permit. It's my goal that when you're sitting at your desk in the office and you're wondering what the permit says, that it will be most convenient to pull up the electronic version of that, since it's going to have the linkage like I mentioned and possibly some other functionality. We do have a question coming in about the coverage card and the coverage letter. As I talked about earlier, I think it's specifically in reference to the card. We are proposing to eliminate the coverage card at this point. We don't require that that card be posted at the site. We have not required that for quite a few years now. I know that those things are used for various other reasons, and I was looking at the cover page that we're going to generate. This is the custom cover page that is for you and your site, and that has all the information that the card had on it. So whatever you were using the card for, I hope that the cover page will suffice for that. That's a good question. That was a change that is going to be a function of the new our new system here. All right, so I am continuing down through our document here, the guide to permit changes. One of the things I put in there is what we're going to do with these ongoing projects. Those are the projects where you already have a permit in your hand and you're out there working, and August is coming up and we're going to change our permit. We're switching to the new permit. So what does that mean for you? Well, the short answer is we're going to handle those projects the same as we've handled them in the past. I did want to highlight it, though, and just go through it for those of you who are new to this program, or maybe we can all just review it together on how this works. And again, this is if a project has permit coverage under the current permit and works ongoing the date that the draft permit is effective. You'll have two choices. You can finish the project following the current permit requirements. Those are the ones that are in place today, and you can take 18 months to do that. This is the same way that we handled it 5 years ago. So if you have a permit, just keep working. If you are not going to be able to finish that project within 18 months of the issuance date, you will be required to update your stormwater pollution prevention plan and follow the new requirements of the draft permit. In the event that the change in the permit language causes a change to your permanent stormwater management system, we are not going to ask you to update your stormwater pollution prevention plan to reflect those changes. For the same reason that we've done before, those systems are often, well, they're designed way in advance, they're often built, or they might be built. It doesn't seem fair to come in and tell somebody that their stormwater treatment pond is no longer acceptable and they need to fill it in and turn it into an infiltration system, or whatever the new requirements may be asking you to do. Those things will not apply to you. It's really just the erosion and sediment control requirements that we want you to update within this 18-month period. That is how we handled it in the previous permit as well. We did add a statement in this draft permit that explains to people who are applying for this new permit now what's going to happen to them 5 years from now, and it's again the same thing. We're committed 5 years from now when we have a new permit, we'll do the same thing. We'll give you 18 months to finish it. If you can't finish it in 18 months, you'll be asked to update the erosion sediment control requirements, and we will not ask you to make any changes to your permanent stormwater management system. Okay, let's talk about the waiting period for coverage. This is a big change. We currently have a mandatory 7-day waiting period when you apply for the permit. We are trying to omit that. We've had a 7-day waiting period for as long as I've worked here, I guess. It seems all states have a waiting period. Some states are as much as a month. The EPA has a waiting period as well. We loved the waiting period as well in the past. You know, we didn't used to have an online application. People applied with paper, and we had to process paper applications. We had to return applications if they were incomplete. We had to get checks cashed. There were a lot of things that had to happen here. The waiting period was very valuable. We are running at pretty much 100% of our applicants coming in online now. And a lot of those issues that we had to deal with just aren't here anymore. And we have found really no compelling reason to make people wait for 7 days, so we are trying to omit that 7-day waiting period. We are omitting that 7-day waiting period. So now that I've said that, you do have to understand that a few things still have to happen in order for you to have your legal NPDES coverage. You do have to successfully complete the online application. Most of the information is required, so you'll need to get through that. You'll need to get to the end, and you'll need to certify that all that information is correct, and you'll have to make the payment. The other thing that's going to have to happen in order for you to receive this thing in the mail is that the bank has to actually transfer the funds. This usually takes 1 business day. Please note that I said business day. If you apply for the permit on a Friday, you're not going to get this email until Monday. If there's a holiday in there, it may take longer than that. So we're omitting the 7-day waiting period. We'd like to get you the coverage as fast as possible, but it's going to be at least 1 day and potentially 3 days if there's a weekend or a holiday. So all that stuff will have to happen, and the way the system works right now is you'll get that notification the next business day, and you won't see it right away in the morning. It usually goes out around 9 or 10 o'clock. We do some manual work on our end with the bank to make sure that all the funds were transferred properly, to make sure that people are not getting a permit without paying for it. Or what's more common is people have accidentally paid for 2 permits. Our finance people go through all that stuff and make sure that we have 1 payment for 1 permit. Once that's all set, they will send that out, and that usually happens around 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning. So we're doing it as fast as possible, but it's not going to be instantaneous. And please keep in mind if there's a weekend in there, that is going to cause you a couple of days delay there. So that is the coverage procedure for most of our projects where you don't have to go through a plan review. We are still going to do a mandatory stormwater pollution prevention plan review for those projects that are disturbing 50 acres or more. And if there's a discharge point on that project within 1 mile of a special water or an impaired water, the permit does ask you to send in that SWIP it asks you to send in the SWIP 30 days before your anticipated start of construction. So we've been doing that now since 2003. We're going to continue to do these plan reviews. You can still use the online application. You can attach the pollution prevention plan right there in the online application. So you have to successfully complete that. The transfer of funds has to happen. The system will not send a coverage email at this time. What will happen is that we get notified that these come in, and we'll contact you. This is what we've been doing since 2003. Within a few days, it doesn't take us too long. One of our review engineers will contact you, let you know that you're in this review procedure and that we're going to be doing this. And if there's any additional information that needs to be sent in, you'll have a contact person and you'll have somebody to talk to as that process is going on. Again, we intend to issue these permits as soon as possible. In this case, it'll be when the review is done. It's our goal to get these done in 30 days. We've got a good track record of getting these reviews done within 30 days, as long as we have all of the information. And once that review is complete, we will make the permit coverage active. And that is something that can happen instantaneously as soon as that's entered into our system. So that's how we're going to handle the 30-day reviews. We're going to continue to call them 30-day reviews, but if we're done with it in 2 weeks, you're going to get your permit in 2 weeks. But we're going to tell everyone to plan for 30 days, get it to us 30 days before your anticipated start of construction, and understand that if the SWIP is incomplete, more time may be needed. All right, moving through our changes document. Let's talk about the stormwater pollution prevention plan for just a minute. This is another section that was rewritten dramatically. It's quite a list of things that we asked for in the pollution prevention plan. A lot of the sections that contain multiple items were divided into individual items. There were some duplicate items in that list as well, so those have been removed. For the most part, the list of SWIP elements that's required is the same. There are some additions and there are some modifications, and we'll go through those. This is all in item 5.1 of the draft permit. I think there's 25 items listed there. Those are all the components that need to be a part of your stormwater pollution prevention plan. So again, it's quite a list. Most of it's the same, but I will highlight those places where it is different. One thing we're going to change is the part about the SWIP amendments. There's a section in the current permit where we talk about SWIP amendments and when those have to happen. And the section in the draft permit starts at 6.1 where we talk about slip amendments. The problem we're finding, our inspectors are going out to a lot of sites and they're seeing that people are not following the stormwater pollution prevention plan. The contractors are sometimes not installing the BMPs that are shown in the SWIP, and they're using less effective BMPs, and frankly, a lot of them that are just not appropriate for the site conditions. So, I don't know, I'll make up an example here. If you're doing work on a bridge abutment with a 45-degree slope down to water, a stream, let's call it, and the SWIP's calling for an erosion control blanket to be installed, we don't want to see just mulch in that area. We don't want the contractors to make that substitution there, because that's not an effective BMP on a 45-degree slope with a stream at the bottom. So here's what we're going to do. Here's what we are proposing here. Both the current and draft permits allow for SWIP amendments. You can change your BMPs whenever you want. We're going to keep that concept the same. We do require that SWIP modifications are documented. We want to see notes in that plan. If you're going to switch the BMPs around like that, it's fine if you want to do that. What the draft permit says is that if a less effective BMP is used, that you have a justification describing how the replacement BMP is effective for the site characteristics, and that needs to be in the stormwater pollution prevention plan. That's the big change. If you don't want to use an erosion control blanket and you want to use mulch, we want to see justification for that. And if you're on a bridge with a 45-degree slope down to a surface water, I'm not sure how you're going to justify that mulch is an appropriate BMP in that case. Now, if you're looking at a stormwater pollution prevention plan where you've got acres and acres of flat areas and there's no surface waters anywhere around, and your stormwater pollution prevention plan engineer has spec'd out blanket across the entire thing, maybe that's a little too robust for the situation. And mulch would be perfectly fine in those particular scenarios. And that's fine. You just need to describe that and put it in the stormwater pollution prevention plan. So things kind of go both ways there. We've got contractors who want to find the least expensive option for a situation, which is a good thing. They should be doing that as long as it's appropriate. And there may be things spec'd out in your pollution prevention plan that you just don't think is necessary. And if you can justify something different, that's fine. Document it in the plan, and that is what the draft permit is asking for. The other piece that we have adjusted here is that all SWIP changes must be done by one of the individuals described in item 21.4 or item 21.5 or another qualified individual. In the draft permit, 21.4 and 21.5 refer to your site manager, who's a person who is supposed to have had training. 21.5. 21.4 is your SWIP designer, who is another individual who's required to have training. We want those people to be the ones that are modifying the pollution prevention plan. Although we did include language that says or another qualified individual. So that is the draft permit and how we want to handle amendments. Another piece of documentation. I know that the pollution prevention plan requires a lot of documentation. It wasn't our goal to load that up with a bunch of new stuff, but we're seeing some of these problems where some of these projects are falling down. We're going to ask for some documentation to try and help that. And here's one of them. Where systems cannot meet the full volume reduction requirement on the site, for example, the site may have infiltration prohibitions, the permit team must document the reasons in the pollution prevention plan. So we have a base requirement in item 5 where we say that we want to see 1 inch of volume reduction from all the new impervious surfaces. That's our core requirement for the stormwater management piece. If you're not able to provide that, we would like to see some documentation in the pollution prevention plan. For most sites, that's going to be that your site has one of the infiltration prohibitions on it. So if you have a site and you've only got 2 feet of clearance between the ground and the groundwater, that is one of the infiltration prohibitions. We don't want to see infiltration on that site. All you need to do is explain that to us in the pollution prevention plan. We have collected quite a few of these plans where we have people doing stormwater ponds, wet sedimentation basins, which are not a volume reduction practice, and there doesn't seem to be any indication that volume reduction was even considered. So that's where this request is coming from. We want to see some documentation. Another piece in regards to our buffer zones. Permittees determine that compliance with the following requirements is infeasible. They must document that determination in the pollution prevention plan. Where we're asking for that is for temporary sediment basins. That's already a requirement in our current permit. For linear projects, if the permanent stormwater treatment system cannot be constructed within the right-of-way, a reasonable attempt must be made to obtain additional right-of-way. We want to see documentation of that. That's in the current permit and the draft permit as well. What we've added is that if buffer zones, as described in item 9.17 and item 23.22, cannot be maintained, that you provide a justification for that as well in the pollution prevention plan. Our inspectors are reporting back that a lot of the buffer zones that they're seeing out there have been cleared, and there doesn't seem to be any apparent reason why. So we don't want to see that. If you're going to be in there and you cannot maintain that 50-foot buffer zone during construction, which is required in 9.17, or if you're not able to maintain the 100-foot buffer around the special and impaired waters, which is item 23.22, we just want to see a justification of that in the pollution prevention plan. All right, moving on to karst areas. We just deleted this part. This section, as you see on your screen here, appears in the current permit. We deleted it. The current permit already prohibits infiltration in karst areas. We have added a requirement. The draft permit now requires a liner for wet sedimentation basins if they are in karst areas. And we were not really able to come up with a whole lot of other reasons why karst would be a factor on a construction project outside of these two spots. So we deleted this general paragraph, and we just now deal with it in the wet sedimentation basin piece and the infiltration piece. And that's as much as I'm going to say about karst. The permanent stormwater treatment part of this permit has changed too. One of the big things that we are adjusting here is how this permit interacts with the MS4 ordinances. The current permit provisions allow developers and consultants to follow the local stormwater treatment requirements instead of following the construction stormwater permit requirements in Part 3D, which is in the second paragraph. I'm sorry, this is described in Part 3D, second paragraph of the current permit. So we added this paragraph last time. It was in response to people saying that there are too many stormwater regulations in the state of Minnesota. We have city ordinances, we have watershed district requirements, and we have this state permit. They all require permanent stormwater management if you're going to for new construction. And the idea was here that these things often read the same, and why do we have to have three overlapping jurisdictions, if you will, with these requirements? So we added a piece to our permit that said if you are in a regulated MS4 community, and that MS4 community has updated their ordinance, as they were supposed to be doing, according to their MS4 permit, that developers and engineers could just follow the local ordinance, and they didn't have to follow the state the state requirements here in this part of the permit. So that was the idea. We ran into a number of problems with this, pretty much right from the get-go. We've saw way too many sites that had local approval that probably shouldn't have had local approval. They certainly wouldn't have been meeting the permit as we had written it. And there are all sorts of reasons for that. I don't want to really get into it too much, but we had people doing infiltration at gas stations. One of the most common things we ran into were sites where they had stormwater ponds, wet sedimentation basins, and really no attempt at doing volume reduction, which was our base requirement for permanent stormwater management. That was one of the most common problems. So some of these cities had updated ordinances, but they maybe were had missed some of the infiltration prohibitions. Some of these some of these communities did not have their ordinances updated. There are all sorts of reasons why. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time getting into it, but we have removed that paragraph. We are going to be expecting everybody to follow this piece of our permit, as they have for the years prior to this attempt that we had here. Moving on. We're still in the section for permanent stormwater treatment systems. I guess I wanted to talk just a minute about the section in general. This is Part 3D of the current permit, and it's item 15 in the draft permit. And we kind of go over the main goals of the permanent stormwater treatment system in this item 15. And we reworked this piece quite a bit. It's very different looking. We tried to make it more clear. And I invite everyone to really read this item 15, go through it. I think there's 9 parts to it. And it should be clear what the goals are. This is not where you'll find the design requirements for our systems. These are the overall goals. So we tried to very clearly define when the permit requires a stormwater treatment system, which is if your project's going to increase impervious surfaces by 1 acre or more, you're required to have a permanent stormwater treatment system. So this section 15 goes on to explain the level of treatment, which basically is we want to see 1 inch volume reduction from those acreage of impervious surfaces. And then we try to step through you what that means. How are you going to achieve this? What methods must be considered first? We want to see volume reduction considered first. And if those methods are not viable, what to consider next. So please read that item 15. It's supposed to be a clear step-through process to clearly define what it is that we expect for the permanent stormwater treatment system. And this is prior to getting into the design requirements, which we'll talk about here. So that's part 15, item 15 in the draft permit. Infiltration prohibitions. The proposed permit prohibits infiltration system constructed as part of the project, regardless of whether or not the construction stormwater permit requires stormwater management if the site receives runoff from vehicle fueling and maintenance areas. So maybe I can back up just a minute there. We have a number of prohibitions in the permit where we don't want to see stormwater infiltration. The way it's set up right now is that none of those apply to your site unless you're required to do infiltration or stormwater management, as I just described. So this is new, this idea that you're looking at right here. This is saying that for any site that's a vehicle fueling and maintenance area, we don't want to see infiltration there. And that's regardless of how much impervious surfaces you've added or subtracted. We don't want you to construct a new infiltration system as part of that project for vehicle fueling and maintenance areas. This will be the only prohibition that would apply to all of those sites. The rest of the stormwater or infiltration prohibitions would only apply if your project is required to build an infiltration system. All right, let's talk about soil information for infiltration design. Out of our current permit that we have today, we state the permittees must employ appropriate on-site testing consistent with the Minnesota Stormwater Manual to verify soil types. That's really all it said, and it referred you to the manual. The manual has tons of information on soil exploration, including how to do it, where to do it, how many times to do it. We're expecting people to follow the stormwater manual. That was the intent. The permit requirements were pretty general, if you will. And I gotta say, we've been a little bit disappointed about the quality of information that engineers are bringing to these stormwater pollution prevention plans. Yeah, we have had people trying to use county soil information, county soil maps. We've had people try to rely on soil borings that were done nearby. A lot of times there was a highway nearby and they collected the old soil borings for those areas and attempted to do design work on those. There were times when we really couldn't find any soil information at all. They have, in their pollution prevention plan, we'd see a nice looking rain garden, would have a depth to it and everything, and but no soil information. So we have modified this piece of the permit quite a bit here. So item 1610 in the draft permit says permittees must provide at least one soil boring, test pit, or infiltrometer test in the location of the infiltration practice for determining infiltration rates. So at least one. Go out there and do some on-site testing to see exactly what's there. It doesn't have to be an infiltrometer test, although that's probably the best thing to do, but at least a soil boring, or dig down and look in there. Do something in that area to find what is exactly in that area. And the permit now requires at least one. If you have a large infiltration area, the manual is going to recommend you do much more than one soil boring or test pit or infiltrometer test, which of course you should do, but the permit is going to require at least one. Item 16.11 is on the same topic here, and we have really just kind of extracted some of that information out of the manual that we were telling people to follow anyway, and we've turned it into a permit requirement. So let's read this one. Item 16.11 in the draft permit. For design purposes, permittees must divide field measured infiltration rates by 2 as a safety factor, or permittees can use soil boring results with the infiltration rate chart in the Minnesota Stormwater Manual to determine the infiltration rates. Those infiltration rates are super important. That is what you're going to base your depth of these systems on. I think all of this stuff is critical to the success of having an infiltration system on your project. We also go on to say that when soil borings indicate a soil, that you should perform field measurements to verify that the rate is not above 8.3 inches per hour. As a reminder, this permit prohibits infiltration if the field measured infiltration rate is above 8.3 inches per hour. We did have a question on this last piece here. We do say that permittees should perform field measurements. That was a question that's come in here. I guess the question was, should that be a must? Permittees must perform field measurements. And I think the answer is no. I think we should keep that as a should. There may be soil types that are not going to require any additional testing because they're not gravelly soils. And this is explained in the manual. Just keep in mind that there is a requirement outside of this that says that infiltration is prohibited if the field measured or if the rates are above 8.3 inches per hour. So this is a bit of a change here. We're not just going to rely on the manual. We have brought some of that stuff forward as permit requirements. Here's another big change. Infiltration prohibitions when you are around or on top of contaminated soils or groundwater. The current permit prohibits infiltration if high levels of soil or groundwater contaminants will be mobilized by the infiltrating stormwater. That's what it says today. We had numerous questions over the past 4 years about what this means and what am I supposed to do. What are high levels? What is the definition of high levels? So if you go to our stormwater manual, we do talk about high levels. We do talk about specific pollutant parameters, and they're listed in there with numbers associated with them. If you were to look at those lists of pollutants and numbers that constitute high levels, it would lead one to think that you are supposed to be doing testing. So is testing required was a common question. How else are you going to know if you are in violation of this permit requirement? And I think think ultimately what people really want to know is what kind of analysis does the agency expect for this determination? These are all good questions. So, the draft permit. It retains the same language here that we have in this box that you'll find in the current permit, and we have added to that. We have added this statement. Permittees must either complete the MPCA site screening assessment checklist or conduct their own assessment to determine the suitability for infiltration. The assessment must be retained with the Stormwater Pollution Prevention Plan. For more information and to access the screening assessment tool, see the Minnesota Stormwater Manual. So, let's take a look at that here. You're going to have to bear with me just a minute here. I've got a lot of screens to flip through here. So, we have developed this page in the Stormwater Manual to help people with this specific requirement. It is item 16.15, and we wanted to lay out exactly what is expected for this. We don't want high levels of contaminants in soil or groundwater to be mobilized. So what does that mean? So take a look at this page. I tried to keep this as short as possible, and I tried to keep this as on topic, that is the permit requirement, is as possible as well. We have tons of information on this particular subject, and it's pages and pages in the manual, but if you want to know what the permit requires, please look at this page. So as you'll see here, under what does this mean, the MPCA does not expect soil or groundwater testing for all construction projects. What we want you to do is use the site screening assessment checklist. This is a pretty high-level screening assessment checklist, and you can open it. You know, I'm going to choose not to open it here. I want you to look at this page. It's a short checklist. It's questions that you could probably answer all of them just by doing a quick site walk. Just go out there and look around. It's going to ask you to look for things like stockpiles. It's going to tell you to look for things like stained soil. And it'll ask you about odors and things like that. It's a pretty high-level checklist. We are asking that everybody go through that if you are proposing infiltration on your site. I know it's a lot to ask for all projects that are going to do infiltration to go through this. However, it's a pretty simple checklist. We are asking that you do it, and we are asking that you maintain it with the pollution prevention plan. So do take a look at that.
We have a couple questions that have come in on your last few slides.
Sure.
We have a question on the safety factor. If you're requiring a safety factor of 2, why would soil survey maps not be adequate versus expensive site borings and testing?
Okay, that's a good question. The county soil maps, they're pretty broad. They're pretty hard to find, those lines, the border lines in between these different soil types. And they just don't have the accuracy that you're going to need. Things aren't going to show up in there like a clay lens. Or worse yet, you know, we ultimately don't know what's happened on this landscape over the years. How do you know there's not a small landfill right under the area where you're posing this thing? We really do want to see on-site testing. And the safety factor, the idea behind that, and you can read about this in the manual, is that the soils do lose some of their infiltrative capacity over time. And we want these things to function long-term, so that's the whole point of the safety factor.
We have one other question on the recent slides. The permit prohibits infiltration in vehicle refueling and maintenance areas. What about facilities where an SPCC plans and oil spill containment measures are required?
Well, they're still going to be prohibited. It's important to remember this prohibition. Okay, first of all, you have to be holding the permit for this to even apply. If you don't have a construction project that disturbed more than 1 acre, then nothing that I'm talking about here today applies to you. So keep that in mind. We're not talking about old facilities. We're not talking about any project where you're not actively holding a construction permit. And can you add anything to that?
No, I think that's a pretty good answer.
Okay.
We also have one more question regarding infiltration. Does this permit require a specific type of infiltration test? The questioner says our organization requires the double ring infiltrometer test, as in our opinion, this produces the most accurate results.
Right, good question. No, we don't have a specific type of infiltration test that we're looking for. In fact, if you want to do a boring and just call it B soils and then go to the chart in the manual, you can get your infiltration rates doing it that way as well. We're trying to keep it open-ended. I think some of these methods are better than other methods. But ultimately what we really want to know is that you went out and looked at the soils and the conditions in the area where the infiltration system is going to be built. Thanks for those questions, and keep those coming in. Back to these contaminated soils or groundwater issues. In addition to that checklist that we are requiring, we are encouraging people to use the What's in My Neighborhood tool that we have on the MPCA website. We have information, very specific information in some cases, on a lot of properties around the state, especially around the metro. You may find the answer to a lot of your questions right here using this tool, the What's in My Neighborhood website. Check that out. The range of information is a wide range of information here. We have very detailed information on pollutants around the metro. We know which way that they're heading in some cases. There's a lot of information here that can assist you in determining whether or not infiltration is appropriate for your site. And what I'll close with here on this topic, if you've gone through the checklist and the site appears to not have, or it's not sending up any red flags off of the checklist, you're welcome to proceed with infiltration. If there are things on the checklist that are raising red flags, or if your property shows up on this What's in My Neighborhood website, we are not asking you to do any further exploration beyond that. You still don't have to go out and do testing. We're telling you that infiltration is not appropriate for your site and that you should try a different method. So that really can be the end of your exploration on this issue. And again, this is just an infiltration prohibition. If you're required to do stormwater management, but you do have contaminated soils on the site, you're still required to do stormwater management. It just can't be through infiltration. We want to see an open water pond. We want to see a filtration system that has a liner. It's just a prohibition for infiltration. Let's talk a minute about drinking water supply management areas. The current permit prohibits infiltration within the entire drinking water supply management area unless allowed by an MS4. That's what we have in the current permit. The draft permit, we have changed this dramatically. The draft permit limits the boundary of prohibition to just the emergency response areas, as defined by the Department of Health, and areas of the drinking water supply management areas that are classified as having high or very high vulnerability, unless a regulated MS4 permittee has performed a higher level of engineering review sufficient to provide a functioning treatment system and to prevent adverse impacts to groundwater. So, if you are in one of these areas, we're going to say that infiltration is prohibited. Unless the MS4 is willing to take a close look at it and make a statement or a claim that what's being proposed here is not going to affect groundwater. And we can take a quick look at how this has changed these boundaries of these areas. If you go into our map tool right now, we added some layers over here, and it's over here under map layers. It's not over here in the legend, where you can turn on these drinking water supply management areas. So I encourage you to go into your city or your area of interest and just take a look at these. The drinking water supply management areas where we have low vulnerability, moderate vulnerability, or high or very high vulnerability have all been mapped. And And we are saying that if you are in these emergency response areas, which are these hashed lines, or if you are in a high or very high area of the drinking water supply management area, which you can find with these layers, infiltration is prohibited unless your project is located within the boundaries of a regulated MS4 community, and that MS4 community is willing to help the developer determine whether or not infiltration is appropriate there. And that's what the permit says. So it's a little bit open-ended on how that determination comes about. And if the MS4 is willing to do that, we are willing to listen to that determination. If they don't feel that they have the expertise or willingness to do that, then we'll just call it prohibited in those areas. You're still required to do stormwater management, whether it be a pond or a filtration system, but we don't want to see an infiltration system. We added these layers to the current special and impaired waters map tool, so you can go in there and look at those today. It does look like this, and we are working on a version of this map tool that's a little bit more user-friendly. We're going to have these layers be transparent so you can see through them. We're going to specifically point out where the highs and the very highs are, because these lows and moderates are not part of the requirement to the permit. So we hope to have a better looking map tool, although I think the data is here if you're curious about a certain area in the state. So take a look at that, and we will make a better looking map tool here for you to use for this requirement. Bear with me 1 second here. All right, a quick one on filtration systems. Do you want me to pause for a minute? Okay. A quick one on filtration systems here.
We do have one question on this last topic. What about drinking water source management areas where there's no MS4 permit scheme?
Oh, there's a good question. Yeah, we have drinking water supply management areas that are not within the boundaries of a regulated MS4 community. Our permit is going to prohibit infiltration in those areas. And the primary reason is we have a relationship, if you will, with our MS4 community. They hold a permit with us. We know who they are. We're comfortable with letting them make this determination. Hopefully they'll consult with us on that. And we're just not comfortable with these drinking water supply management areas that are all over the state. And, we just don't know who these people are or their level of what's the word I'm looking for? Expertise on this subject. Thank you.
We also have another question. Please discuss seasonally saturated soil versus groundwater. My understanding is if modeled soil, like for septic system design, is found within 3 feet of the surface, this is considered an infeasible area for infiltration.
Yeah, that is a good question. I think I have that covered here in the slide coming up. If not, I will try to remember to come back to that. Let's take a look at filtration systems here. We have a new requirement that we added to the filtration system section. It's very similar to the requirement we already have for an infiltration system. Let's read it here. The filter media must not be installed until the contributing drainage area has been constructed and fully stabilized unless rigorous erosion prevention and sediment controls are provided to keep sediment and runoff completely away from the filtration area. This is what it says in the current permit and draft permit for an infiltration system, where we are trying to avoid the clogging of native soils. For a filtration system, we're less worried about the native soils in a filtration system because a filtration system is going to have an underdrain on top of the native soils with a filter media on top of that. So if there's construction runoff going into a filtration system before the media is installed and before the underdrain is installed, it's not really going to cause a plugging that's going to cause a failure. But once that filter media is installed, we definitely do not want construction stormwater runoff from entering those areas, clogging up the filter media. So it is an extension of the same idea we have for infiltration systems. We did word it such that we are talking about the filter media here and not the native soils. We're not concerned about the native soils, the in-place soils for a filtration system. We're just trying to save the filter media here with this additional requirement. Wet sedimentation basins. I think this is item 18 in our permit. We have our long list of design parameters. We made one adjustment to those design parameters, where we are now going to say that permittees must design these basins using an impermeable liner if located within active karst terrain. I mentioned this earlier. The stormwater manual has always recommended a liner in those areas. We've always told people to install liners in those areas. It's never really been in the permit, and now it is. Conveyance channels. How are we doing for time? 55 minutes. Okay, great. Conveyance channels. Part 4B3 of the current permit that we have today, you will find this requirement. You know what? I'm not going to read the whole thing. It does talk about conveyance channels. It does talk about routing stormwater around sites. This piece of the permit was added because of the EPA C&D rule. I believe we took it word for word. We have a lot of requirements already in the permit for ditches and what we expect people to do around ditches. So this conveyance channel piece was in addition. And we added it because of the C&D rule. So quite honestly, I'm not exactly sure how this requirement came into play on a lot of construction sites. I mean, I get what they're saying here, but I don't know that it's possible to always route stormwater around the site. It didn't seem appropriate on all sites, and like I said, we had a number of requirements already in the permit for what to do with swales. And I guess I got the idea that I would summarize all of those ideas, and you can find those in the Guide to Changes document. I summarized everything we had for drainage ditches in our permit, and I sent it to the EPA, and I said, we're thinking about deleting this piece. I know it's part of your C&D rule, but I feel like we've got quite a few requirements for drainage ditches, and I think the intent of everything that we had put together kind of covered what the C&D rule was asking for in this piece, so I proposed to delete it, and the EPA concurred that that was probably fine. They told me to take careful notes about that. That's why in your Guide to Changes document, the explanation for this piece is so long compared to the other ones. I just cut and pasted my email to the EPA right into that document. So I hope that's enough explanation for this. This paragraph has been deleted. We feel that we've got these channels protected and covered through our other permit requirements. Let's talk about ditch stabilization. We've changed this piece a little bit as well. Maybe I'll set this up here with this permit requirement, which leads into the next piece. This has not changed. You can find this in the current permit and the draft permit. Permittees must stabilize the normal wetted perimeter of the last 200 lineal feet of any temporary or permanent drainage ditch or swale to drain water from the site within 24 hours after connecting to a surface water or property edge. Permittees must complete the stabilization in the remaining portion of these ditches within 14 calendar days. So we kept that piece. The current permit that we have out today makes a little clarification on this, and it says that permittees must not use mulch, hydromulch, or tackifier, or similar erosion prevention practices within any portion of the normal wetted perimeter of a temporary or permanent drainage ditch or swale. So that's what we've been running with for quite a few permit cycles now. And we have added this piece with a continuous slope of greater than 2%. So while we were very prescriptive as to not use mulch anywhere in a ditch, we are changing our position on this. If you want to try mulch or hydromulch on some of these flatter ditches, the permit's going to say that that's okay. We heard from a lot of people on this permit requirement, a lot of people at Department of Transportation, and a lot of people that do county road projects, and that type of construction. We do have a lot of flat parts in the state of Minnesota. We have ditches that are at 1%. We have ditches that are at 0%. If you have a project like that and you want to try mulching those areas, the permit's going to now say that that's all right. Anything with a continuous slope of greater than 2%, we are going to be looking for the more robust erosion control practices like blanket and not mulch. As with all the BMPs in our permit, if the selected BMP is found to be inadequate at minimizing erosion from ditches or swales, another more effective BMP must be utilized. So you may still end up having to blanket some of these ditches, but the permit is allowing you a different starting spot. If you want to use mulch and try it and see if you can get vegetation going, the permit will say that's okay. If it's getting blown out and washed away every time it rains, just like every other BMP in the permit, we would ask you to do something that is a step above, a level higher. Word about stockpiles. This isn't necessarily new, in my opinion. It's more of a clarification. But I think that there's been some misunderstanding about this requirement. We say that permittees must provide silt fence or other effective sediment controls at the base of stockpiles. I'm sorry, that's the piece we added. We added the words at the base. We've always required sediment controls around stockpiles. We're now going to say that it has to be at the base. And just to clarify, this is to help clarify that this whole requirement is separate from the sediment control requirements that we discussed earlier in 9.2. So hopefully that makes it more clear. There seems to be a little bit of a misunderstanding amongst permittees. A lot of people felt that if they had perimeter control around the entire site, that they were automatically in compliance with the stockpile requirements, no matter where the stockpile was inside of the site. That is not true. This is a separate piece. So we're trying to clarify that here. We made a little adjustment to the buffer requirement. And this is the 50-foot buffer that we have, the buffer requirement we have around surface waters. This is more or less the same what you see in the box here. We did add that if you're not able to preserve the 50-foot buffer, you are required to have redundant sediment controls, and we added the piece that's underlined here. Permittees must install these perimeter sediment controls at least 5 feet apart unless you're limited by lack of available space. And again, this came from our inspectors who routinely saw 2 biologs right on top of each other, or 2 silt fences right next to each other when there was plenty of space to move these things apart. They're much more effective if you can get some spacing in between them. So we added this. Let's get those things 5 feet apart. We do recognize that you're going to be short of space in some areas, and if so, then you need to comply with this piece. But we added the spacing requirements.
We do have a question coming in on your last slide regarding stockpiles and perimeter control. Regarding stockpile perimeter control, what acceptable distance from the base of the pile does the sediment control have to be located in?
Oh, that's a good question. The separation distance is not currently defined in the draft permit. 5 feet would be a nice recommendation. We did not put that in the draft permit. Perhaps that's a good suggestion. Please put that into a comment. Right, it has to be effective. That's the requirement. You can increase the effectiveness by adding some space in there. We have recommendations on a lot of this stuff in the manual. Again, not all of this stuff becomes permit requirements. But yes, the draft permit does not specify.
And then one more question on the buffer you just talked about.
Yeah.
Can you be in the buffer area if redundant sediment controls are in place?
Can you be in the buffer area if redundant sediment controls are in place? I guess the answer to that is yes. Yeah, you're supposed to be avoiding those areas. The 50-foot buffer the 50-foot buffer is a sediment control requirement. And of course, the permit recognizes that you're going to have to be in there for certain reasons. And if you are in there, then that's when the redundant controls are needed. And of course, you must document that as the new piece that we added. I'll talk a little bit more about buffer zones. We have the 100-foot buffer zone that appears in our permit for special waters. I want to spend a little more time on buffers, so we'll come back to that here towards the end of this. Let's talk about timing for BMP maintenance after inspections. This might have been one of my favorite additions to the draft permit because it caused so many questions and comments. We currently say that all non-functional BMPs need to be repaired or replaced or supplemented with functional BMPs by the end of the next business day after discovery. This is the part of the permit in the inspection piece where we talk about your reaction to the inspections. And we are giving people to the end of the next business day to get this stuff replaced or supplemented or repaired. Well, we did hear from our own inspectors and from the regulated community that, doing this stuff the next day is just often not possible. And they really wanted more time. They didn't feel that the permit was giving them any option to be in compliance if they weren't able to get a hold of the right person to get out there the next day. So we were toying with the idea of giving people more time. And this is what we put in the draft permit. Permittees must repair, replace, supplement the BMPs prior to the next anticipated rain event or 3 calendar days, whichever comes first.
We do have a question that came in on this part. What is considered the next anticipated rain event?
Yeah, we had a number of comments on this. The comments are, what is a rain event? How does the MPCA expect me to comply with this? It does definitely leave open some questions here. We talk about the next rain event, I guess just in one other place of the permit. We do have a requirement for perimeter controls, and we do state in there that those perimeter controls can be taken down for temporary construction activity and that they should be replaced before the next rain event. That's been a piece of the permit for many years. I guess in my personal opinion, it doesn't seem outlandish to have the forecast be a part of these permit requirements. The forecast is so readily available. We all have it in our pocket. Relying on the forecast within a permit requirement doesn't seem outlandish to me. The way this is written, of course, we're still left with some questions. What is a rain event? What is an anticipated rain event? There are some things we could do to this to make it a little more concise, if you will. I'll offer this up as an option. In the California NPDES permit, I noticed they have several permit requirements that rely on the forecast. Depending on whether or not it's going to rain, their permit requirements change. They're forecast dependent. The way that they do it is with this statement. I'll read it out loud here. If there is a higher than 50% chance of any rain event occurring the next day, that would be considered an anticipated rain event. And in California, it triggers something. Here in this, for this requirement, we're talking about getting these BMPs repaired. So I'll repeat that. It's a greater than 50% chance of any rain event. I think that's pretty good. Any one of us can reach into our pockets and determine if there's more than a 50% chance of rain tomorrow. And you can base your schedule for maintaining these things on that information. That's just a suggestion. I'd like to see some comments come back on this piece. There's other ways of handling this as well. And it is a bit open-ended the way it is here. We don't have to make this change. If it's more clear or more palatable to keep the requirement as it is, that's certainly an option as well. So I'm going to be looking for comments on this piece. Tell me what you don't like about it, and give me some examples of language that might make it better for you. If we can nail this down, I'm happy to do that. I try to avoid these long-winded specific requirements. But if that's what we need here to make it workable, then that's what we need. I'll say on that. Here's a quick one about hazardous materials or on-site equipment fueling. These are located in the pollution prevention part of the current permit, which is part 4F. And in the draft permit, we're at item 12.4 and 12.7. We just deleted these two pieces. The current permit requires restricted access storage areas, or requires restricted access storage areas must be provided to prevent vandalism. We also say that the permittees must conduct fueling in a contained area unless infeasible. We deleted both of those things. We deleted these. Some of the stuff that we get into in the pollution prevention section, I start to wonder whether or not it's really a stormwater requirement. Vandalism is one thing. If you've got vandalism on your site, you probably have problems that are that you're going to need to react to those. And same with vehicle fueling areas. If you spilled on your site, you're still responsible for that. You're still responsible for vandalism. You're responsible for things that have been spilled. That's regardless of any permit period. They just didn't seem like they were appropriate, and we removed those. That's as much as I'll say on that. Final stabilization was the title of one of our permit sections in the current permit, Part 4C9, to be specific. It is item 13.1 in the draft permit. We just renamed this piece. Instead of calling it final stabilization, we're now calling it permit termination conditions. That's really what it is. If you read it, there's 5 things on that list, and they are the things that you need to do before you can terminate the permit. One of those things in that list was that you have permanent cover on your entire site. And all too often I have heard people use the term final stabilization when they really meant permanent cover, and it seems to be causing some confusion. And it seemed like an easy way to solve this by just retitling the section Permit Termination Conditions. So take a look at that. The actual list below that is the same. We made no changes in there. It's just a change in title. So let's talk about discharges to prohibited waters. One of the things that we have to deal with here in this new permit are the new Minnesota rules addressing anti-degradation. This is one thing that has changed since the last permit, and one thing that we were required to write something different about. We have this classification now that's called prohibited waters, and it's a higher tier, and it requires more protection. This is all part of the anti-deg rule that passed in Minnesota a couple years ago. Federal rules require all NPDES permits to meet these state rules for anti-degradation as well. We had to put something in for projects that discharge to prohibited waters. So we have that now. The prohibited waters is a smaller subset of our special waters that we've always had. In fact, the actual bodies of water that we're talking about here haven't changed. It is proposed as a prohibited water is still protected as a special water under the current permit. It's just now in a different classification. So if you look at our whole list of special waters in the back, which is long, and there's all of the different types of special waters, the wilderness areas, the Mississippi River, they're all listed back there. That list is the same. We haven't changed the actual waters at all. But we are changing the requirements to a subset of those waters, which is called the prohibited waters. So now, if you have a construction project on these waters, we have added some additional best management practices, and they are that permittees must conduct routine site inspections once every 3 days, as described in item 12.2. If you go to item 12.2, that is the inspection requirement we have for all projects. It states that you will be doing inspections once every 7 days on your site. Well, if your project's discharging into a prohibited waters, we want you to be doing those inspections more often. That is once every 3 days. Also, as part of this, if discharges to prohibited waters cannot provide volume reduction equal to 1 inch of runoff from the new impervious surfaces as required in item 15, the permittees must develop a permanent stormwater treatment plan that will result in no net increase in TSS or phosphorus to the prohibited water. You must keep that plan with your stormwater pollution prevention plan for the project. So a couple pieces of clarification here. We do believe for all projects that if you can meet our volume reduction requirement in item 15, that is, provide volume reduction of 1 inch times the impervious surface created by the project, that will result in no increase of TSS or phosphorus. We are basing that on everything we learned through the MIDS process. That's the base requirement we're asking for all projects that you do this volume reduction requirement. Now, for other projects not around prohibited waters, if you can't do that, if you can't provide 1 inch of volume reduction, the permit would ask you to do a stormwater pond, which is fine for all of those other projects. But we have documented through the MIDS effort and other research that a stormwater pond itself is not going to get you that reduction in phosphorus that volume reduction will get you. And it's not acceptable to just have a pond if you're going to be discharging to prohibited waters. So you need to come up with some other plan. The infiltration requirement will get you there, but if infiltration is prohibited or if you're on top of bedrock or it's not conducive for one reason or another, you're going to have to come up with something else, and you're required to put that plan in the SWIP for the project. So there's a lot of talk here about these discharges to prohibited waters. I'd like you to keep in mind that there are very few projects that will be discharging to these prohibited waters. Just due to their very nature. We're talking about places like the Boundary Waters Canoe area. We're talking about places that it's going to be pretty hard to get a building permit for anything anyways. And there probably will be some. The most common example, or the prominent example I can think of would be a bridge over one of these waters that has to be replaced. That's a very likely scenario. Again, if you can do 1 inch of volume reduction, you'll be in compliance with this piece, item 23.25, and if you can't, you're going to have to come up with something else. I encourage you to call us. I think we can come up with things using vegetation, grass swales, ponding, combinations of these things. Perhaps iron-enhanced sand filters would be an option for some of these areas. Potentially tricky, but not potentially a lot of projects here. And as with all projects, if you want assistance with this stuff, please call us, and we will help you get through this. Temperature controls for trout streams. This piece has changed a bit. Let's read the base requirement here. This part has not changed. We are saying, and will continue to say, the permittees must design a permanent stormwater treatment system so that the discharge from the project minimizes the increase in the temperature of trout streams resulting from the 1 and 2 year 24-hour storm event. This includes tributaries. And we say that permittees must incorporate one or more of the following measures in the order of preference. So the current permit has a list, A, B, C, D, E, of these things that we want you to try. We have modified that list. The draft permit has reorganized these a bit. In the current permit, number 1 was to minimize the new impervious surfaces. Well, that might be one of the best things you can do for temperature. That's something you should be looking at during the planning phase of your project. But if you are still creating new impervious surfaces, you need a BMP to mitigate for that. And simply minimizing it doesn't mitigate the impervious surfaces that you have created. It didn't make a whole lot of sense. We took A out of this list. And the other ones are listed there. We're talking about disconnected impervious surfaces. Letter C talks about doing stormwater infiltration. D talks about ponding, and E ends with other methods. So the new list is different from that. We are now saying that if you can provide infiltration as described in item 15, that is all we're going to ask for temperature mitigation if you are discharging to a trout stream. This is similar to what I just described. If you can provide 1 inch of volume reduction per the base requirement that you'll find back in item 15, that really is the best thing you can do for temperature control in trout streams. So we move that to number 1. If your site's not conducive to infiltration, the next best thing you could do is filtration, and we described that in item 17. If you can get 1 inch through a filtration system and discharge to a trout stream, that is probably the second best thing you can do. And from there, we talk about minimizing connected impervious surfaces. We do talk about ponding. We do say if ponding is used, that you try to use shading, filter bottom withdrawal, vegetative swale discharge as opposed to a pipe, or if you do have a pond, that it draws down in 24 hours or less. And E ends with other methods. I want to come back to ponding around trout streams too. We had questions on that earlier, but this is the temperature control for trout streams as you see it in the draft permit. We have just reorganized that list, if you will, that we have in the current permit. All right, let's talk about who should be listed as a permittee. As you know, this program is a co-permittee program. We have an owner and an operator that sign on to this. They are the people who are legally responsible for everything that's in the permit. We intend to more clearly define who the owner and operator is. We have added a new definition for general contractor. Let's take a look at that. The general contractor means the party who signs the construction contract with the owner to construct the entire project described in the plan and specifications. Where the construction project involves more than one contractor, the general contractor is the party responsible for managing the entire project on behalf of the owner. That's a new definition that we added. It is word for word the definition of general contractor that we had in our permit, I think 3 permit cycles ago. And we have not had a definition for general contractor since then. So we're bringing that back. It ties into the definition we have for operator, and we added that underlined part there. Let's read the whole thing. Operator means the person, usually the general contractor, designated by the owner who has day-to-day operational control and or the ability to modify the project plans and specifications related to the pollution prevention plan. Subcontractors hired by and under supervision of the general contractor are not operators. So this is not really intended to be a change in our permit. This is what we have been talking about. However, it seems that a few of our enforcement actions and a few of our inspectors are finding situations where the people we have listed on the permit are not the general contractor. It is, in fact, a subcontractor hired by the general contractor. And for one reason or another, that's who's listed on the permit application. We are trying to avoid that. If you are a subcontractor that was not hired by the owner and you are answering to the general contractor, it makes it very difficult for us to do an enforcement action when we bring in the owner and a subcontractor who is he's not answering to the owner. We've got a disconnect there. So we are trying to avoid that. And I think most people are doing this correctly. I don't think this is going to be a wide-changing modification to our permit here. I think that there are a few specific companies that have been doing this as a matter of practice, and we are going to try and change that. Again, I don't view this as a change, although I'm hoping that the adjustments we made here in the language make it a little bit more clear. I did talk to the EPA about this approach as well. I wanted to make sure that we weren't doing something that was vastly different than what they were doing, and they concur that this is their policy as well. Most states are set up the same way. They're not all set up this way. In fact, we're not required to have the operator as a permittee at all. But we do in the state of Minnesota. We have established this co-permittee approach, and I think we're going to keep that. So take a good look at these definitions and see if this what this means for you.
We have a question, several questions regarding the prohibited waters, additional BMPs. Specifically, does the 3-day inspection time frame apply to all special and impaired waters or just prohibited waters?
That's a good question. That 3-day inspection only applies to the prohibited waters. I know that section of the permit, we received a few other comments. It's item 23 where we talk about all these additional requirements and the additional bodies of water that they apply to. There's been some confusion as to what applies to what in there, and it does look vastly different than the current permit. So please provide comments on that. If there's a way we can make that more clear, I would like to do so. I will offer this up too. We do have the special and impaired water search tool. We have built the pop-up windows for when you click on those bodies of water to reflect the new permit requirements. If you want to use the map tool, that might be a better way to understand this stuff. If you click on the map tool on a prohibited water, that pop-up window is going to contain those extra BMPs, the ones that are in question here. And the other special waters will not. So that is another way to go to get the answer to which BMPs apply to which water. I do want the permit language to be clear, though, so we will take a look at how that is presented in there. The last thing on our list, if you're looking at the guide to permit changes, the last item we have here is what I call rule references to this permit. This item was added to the proposed permit to preserve continuity with state rules, such as MNR 7090, or other documents which refer to specific parts of the construction permit by name that will no longer be used. So, go back to the beginning of the presentation today. I told you that in the table of contents, we're taking out Roman numerals 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 from the table of contents. Some of those Roman numerals are these parts right here. Roman numeral 3 is titled Stormwater Discharge Design Requirements. Reference to that part of the permit is in our Rule 7090 and in some of our other rules. And that's gone now. We don't have that section titled anymore. Part 4 of the current permit is titled Construction Activity Requirements. That is slated to be deleted. We're not going to have a section titled that anymore. The pieces within that are still there, but that title is gone. Appendix A, there's no more Appendix A. That is all covered in item 23. So that posed quite a problem for us. In our rules 7090 and others, we talk about these sections of the permit. We have it in our other rules. We mentioned stormwater discharge design requirements in some of our fact sheets. The Department of Transportation has cited these sections of the permit in their spec book. I have seen these section titles in cities' ordinances. Those are going to be gone. So I added this piece to the permit. Let's see if I have it here. I do have it here. I'm sorry, I don't have the exact language out of the permit. Anyways, this piece was added to the draft permit such that we could just preserve that continuity. So when you see, sorry, I'm trying to go back a slide here. When you see the term stormwater discharge design requirements in a rule or perhaps a fact sheet, you can refer to this section to know what it is that we're talking about. So in item 24.11 of the draft permit, you'll see stormwater discharge design requirements corresponds to item 5.1 through item 6.4 and item 14.1 through 21.6. I know that's kind of cumbersome, but it does kind of connect the dots for people who are looking at Minnesota Rule 7090 and want to know what that means, and when they go to the permit, they're not going to see these headings anymore. So I'm just trying to preserve that continuity until we have an opportunity to change our rules and change our fact sheets. Hopefully this is helpful to you as well, if this is in your ordinance. But I'm just going back to what I said when we modified that table of contents. There were ramifications for removing some of those items, and I want you to think about those, and then look at this piece, item 24.11, and see if that fixes the problem for you. If not, please comment, and maybe we can do something else to preserve that continuity. But we did cause a little trouble by taking those titles out of the table of contents. So here's my example. We have Rule 7090, and this is what it says word for word right out of the register. For the purposes of these parts, the, quote, stormwater discharge design requirements, construction activity requirements, and Appendix A. Well, those things aren't going to mean anything in the draft permit, because those words are gone. Oh, here's the piece I was looking for. This is the actual item 24.11. So think about your own fact sheets, your own ordinances, or any other times that you've referenced our construction permit, and see if this piece is helpful for you. That does bring us to the end of the changes to the permit document. I'll just keep rolling here because we've had questions come in. We had questions come in ahead of time too. I did say that I would talk about buffer zones a little bit more. I want to get back to that as well. First of all, let's just talk about buffer zones and how the permit talks about buffer zones. There are two very distinct pieces to our permit that refer to buffer zones. We have in the sediment control practice section a 50-foot buffer zone requirement, which, as I said, was part of the EPA's C&D rule. You're required to maintain a 50-foot buffer zone or provide redundant sediment controls during construction. That is solely intended as a sediment control practice. That's why we put it in that section. That was the EPA's intent. It is a during construction requirement, and that is what it's for. That was added on the previous permit cycle due to the C&D rule. Prior to that, we have always had a 100-foot buffer requirement around special waters only, which appears in Appendix A of the current permit. And that is a different buffer requirement. And I want to make that clear. That 100-foot buffer is in there for sediment control during construction, but it is intended to be a permanent buffer that is maintained both during construction and after construction. It only applies to special waters. We didn't change that piece. But it is different. It's there for a different reason. It's in a different part of the permit. So one question that came in was if the 100-foot buffer zone cannot be met due to site constraints, is redundant perimeter control acceptable? That was the question we had. I have an answer for that. And again, this is a separate requirement from the other buffer zone. What we do say in the buffer zone requirement for the 100-foot buffer around special waters, that you do need to maintain this 100-foot buffer zone. There are exceptions to that. We've always said that if you have a stream crossing or an encroachment like that that is necessary, where you have to be within 100 feet of the special water, that's okay. You're supposed to document that in the pollution prevention plan. And we say that all potential water quality and scenic and other environmental impacts of these exceptions must be minimized by the use of additional or redundant BMPs. So, back to the question. Is a double row or a redundant BMP acceptable? It's a complicated answer. You are required to minimize these impacts. And a double row of silt fence may be the answer to that. But I'll just throw out a couple of examples here, and I'm kind of just making these up here. You know, if you have a bridge pier that has to go in, and the bridge pier is such that it leaves you with, let's say, 90 feet between the bridge pier and the water itself that we're trying to protect, and it's vegetated, and you're going to keep it vegetated, and you got 90 feet there, and it's flat, and there doesn't really appear to be any way that sediment's going to escape the work that you're going to do around this bridge pier, you may not need any additional requirements or controls in that area. The buffer zone requirement in Appendix A and in Item 23 is that you have to determine this. If your bridge pier is right on the edge of the water, perhaps you're going to completely isolate the zone with a sheet pile. So it's 100% contained in of itself. That may be the only protection that you need there. You know, if your bridge pier is somewhere in between, then yeah, a double row of silt fence is probably the right thing to do there. So it is not as specific as it is in the 50-foot buffer requirements, where we specifically say that if you don't have it a solid 50 feet there, bam, the requirement is that you have redundant controls and also that you have 5 feet of spacing if you got room for it. So I hope that clarifies how that works. It is 2 separate requirements in the permit. Yeah, if you're having trouble or if you have questions on what you think might be adequate for a certain area, you can always call us. I say that over and over again. We have an engineering staff here that's willing to sit down with you and help you on a specific case-by-case basis for this or for any of the other permit requirements. If something's in question or if you're not sure how to do it or what it means, please call us. That was a question that came in. Yeah, back to the question about seasonally saturated soils versus elevation of groundwater, all in regards to whether or not infiltration is appropriate on a specific site. It was a good question that came in. There does seem to be some confusion about that. I have seen people try and use piezometers to determine whether or not infiltration is appropriate for a site. Piezometers are great to tell you where the groundwater is today, but the requirement in the permit is that you have 3 feet of separation between the bottom of the infiltration system and the elevation of the seasonally saturated groundwater level, which is not the groundwater level that's there today. It's the groundwater level that you would see on average throughout the season. So it's a great question that came in. We do expect people to be looking for that seasonally saturated groundwater level, and specifically those redoxamorphic features in the soil. And let's try and trace this through here. The permit requirement does say seasonally saturated soils. What might not be evident as you're reading the permit is that we have a definition for seasonally saturated soils. You have to flip back to the definition section, and you will see that seasonally saturated soils means the highest seasonal elevation in the soil in a reduced chemical state because of soil voids filled with water causing anaerobic conditions. Seasonally saturated soil is evidenced by the presence of redoxamorphic features or other information determined by scientifically established methods or empirical field measurements. All of that stuff should be used to determine the seasonally saturated soil. So we are looking for those redoxamorphic features. And if you want to dive into this a little bit further, we have a definition for redoxamorphic features. That's in the current permit and the draft permit. Redoxamorphic features means color patterns in soil formed by oxidation and reduction process of iron and or manganese in seasonally saturated soil. So we are specifically looking for that elevation of the redoxamorphic features. And we do want to see 3 feet between that elevation and the elevation of the bottom of the infiltration system. I hope that answers the question. All that information is in the permit right now. However, you would not have caught that if you did not go back to the definition section. I guess I could take a minute to also point out that in our draft permit, we no longer have bolded words to indicate where we have a defined word, like we do in the current permit. That was one of the things that we were not able to do with this new format and this new computer system. I was a little bit bummed out about it at first, However, now that I've had a chance to look at these two permits side by side, it really was a little distracting to have so many bolded words throughout this document. So, for better or worse, there are no more bolded words in the permit. Definitions, of course, are still there, and you'll have to be aware of that, I guess. What else do we have here? We had another question come in. This was a good one. This was in regards to our sediment control practices that we have, specifically when it comes to perimeter control and storm drain inlets, which in our draft permit is Part 9.2 and 9.7. Part 9.2 says that you must keep the sediment control practices in place until permanent cover is established, which means a full stand of vegetation. In item 9.7, we've said that storm drain inlets need to remain in place until all sources with the potential for discharging to the inlet are stabilized. So the question is that permanent stabilization, is that what's the intent for both of those? And the answer is yes. Storm drain inlets are supposed to be in place until the areas surrounding it have permanent cover. And I think that we have that not worded as clear as it could be in the draft permit, so we will make that change. We are looking for permanent cover before those items can be removed. Another question that came in regards to areas around trout streams, we didn't talk about this too much, but we have adjusted the requirements for how we set up our infiltration systems and our filtration systems. Namely, what I'm talking about is that we want these infiltration systems to draw down in 24 hours instead of 48 hours, which is what the permit requires for most projects. So the question was, is it 24 hours for all of the practices? And the answer is yes. Whether you're doing infiltration, filtration, or a pond of any kind, we want those things to draw down in 24 hours and not 48 hours. The second half of the question that came in is, are wet ponds allowed in these areas around trout streams? I guess there's a two-part answer to that. First of all, if you're required to provide stormwater management because your projects increase the impervious surface by 1 acre or more, that's when you have to follow everything that we say in the permit. That's what's going to tell you that you have to do infiltration. In the permit, it's going to say if you're not doing infiltration, you should try some other method. And in the trout stream section, we talk about ponding, and we say that we don't want to see ponds or ponded water for more than 24 hours. We really want to see the dry ponds around trout streams. If you're required to do stormwater management and infiltration is not going to work for you, and a pond is the next best or the best thing, we want it to be a dry pond. It's the only time we'll allow a dry pond. We don't like dry ponds for water quality management, but in certain situations around trout streams, that's going to be the best that we can get for water quality purposes. Now, I think the question here is revolving more around rate control. Rate control is required too on projects. That's not part of our permit. We don't require rate control ever in the NPDES permit. We're strictly a water quality permit, not a flooding permit. But there may be a local ordinance or local requirements that have rate control. That's very common. So the question is the wet pond allowable for rate control? We would not recommend that due to thermal reasons. But if it's something that you're building and you're not building it because the permit required you to build it, we really don't have a prohibition against a wet pond. I guess my question back to you would be, can a dry pond work for your rate control? To my knowledge, a dry pond is equally as effective as a wet pond for rate control. Can be if you set it up properly. That's what we would recommend, but it would not be an all-out prohibition on a wet pond.
We've got one more question that came in regarding the 100-foot buffer.
Yeah.
Since the 100-foot buffer is a requirement of post-construction as well as during construction, what would redundant BMPs look like as a function of post-construction? Would there need to be a permanent stormwater management system to offset the impacts of encroaching on that buffer?
That is a great question. No, everything I said in regards to redundant sediment controls as they work for our 100-foot buffer, that is for during construction. Now, the 100-foot buffer zone does talk about maintaining that buffer post-construction. So no, you don't need a redundant control per se, but if you do have impacts within that buffer zone, again, it's fairly high level, but we do say that all potential water quality, scenic, and other environmental impacts must be minimized. So if you are outside of the, if you are encroaching on the buffer with a structure or something like that, yeah, some type of stormwater management might be required there, and the permit is not super specific about it. If you have new impervious surface, you need to account for that. If you're replacing existing impervious surface, perhaps a good solution to this permit requirement would be to provide stormwater management in those areas. Do a rain garden, do an infiltration system. Even though you don't have new impervious surface, those would be the types of mitigation things that would apply to this buffer zone requirement. All right, so we are nearing the end here. I have a couple things I want to leave you with. The public comment period has been extended, as I mentioned, to May 23rd. I would like to clarify that anything that you submitted in writing for today's presentation, I'm asking you to resend that as a comment so we can get it into the official record. We are not going to maintain what was submitted prior to today, or for today, in the permanent record as far as comments go. I'll offer this up too. You guys are asking great questions and they're really helpful. We really appreciate that, and we appreciate the comments. If you have questions over the next few weeks while you're putting your comments together, why don't you send them to the constructionstormwater.pca website, or email address there, and I or one of us will try to respond to you guys while you do it, while you're doing the comments, if it's something you think would help you formulate a better comment. We are nearing the end of our presentation today. Thanks for joining us. We had almost 200 connections. I think some of these connections had more than one person, so we probably have over 200 people involved here today, which is great. This was our first attempt at trying to do a public meeting, if you will, via webinar. So everyone's interested in feedback on how this went today. Thanks everyone, and we're signing out.